Okay, so we're on to lesson 6 in unit 2, and this lesson concerns drawing scatter plots and lines of best fit. So these notes are fairly short because we are going to focus a little bit more on applying this topic to different situations. So it's best to learn this by being exposed to different situations, which would take too long in a set of notes. So I just want to get the basics down in the notes so that we have the tools we need to draw lines of best fit and read lines of best fit, more importantly. So we're going to create and interpret scatter plots. So the vocabulary should be finished by now, and these definitions, hopefully they make a little bit of sense. What I really want to focus on is how to talk about correlation and describe it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump right to example 1. And in example 1, I ask that for each scatter plot, you describe the correlation shown and tell whether the correlation coefficient is closest to -1, -0.5, 0, 0.5, or 1. So with correlation coefficient, that tells us the strength. So a correlation coefficient of 1 is a perfect positive correlation. A correlation coefficient of -1 is a negative correlation that is perfect. Now, in real life situations, we will never see perfect correlation. We will see correlation coefficients in the 0.9 range mostly if it's really, really good, but we think of 1 and -1 as perfect correlation. Okay, so when we look at part A in this example, the first thing I would ask you to describe the correlation shown. So this correlation, all we've got to say is that this correlation shows as x increases, y decreases. That is what we call a negative correlation. Okay. And I know I just said that a perfect negative correlation is -1. Okay. Correlation coefficient of -0.5 is very, very weak negative correlation. And then 0.5 would be pretty weak positive correlation. So for this, I'd say this is fairly well related negatively. So I would say, I'm not saying it's -1, but I would say it's closest. I'd say it's closer to -1. Okay. Doesn't mean it is -1, but I would say it's very closely related. So I'd say that correlation coefficient is going to be in that 0.9 range, I would think. 0.8 to 0.9 range. Now in part B, this has a positive, this has a positive correlation. Okay. And it is fairly weak. Okay. It's fairly weak to me. So I would say for that, I would say the correlation coefficient is closest to +0.5. Okay, and the reason I say that is because, yes, it is positively related, but these points are a little hard to predict. So they don't follow a line with a positive slope very closely, right? There is a relation there, but I'd say it's fairly weak. Okay, so when we talk about this, is the correlation fairly strong, fairly weak, or is there no correlation at all? And this is really a judgment call. When we go to actual examples, guys, we are going to be getting an actual number for correlation coefficient. So that's an important thing to remember. So as for the guided practice here, take a few seconds. And again, if you're good at seeing positive correlation, and really just think weak, strong, okay? So if it really follows a line fairly closely, say it's closer to 1 or -1, but again, just take a minute and I will reveal my answers, but this is a good chance for you to pause for a few seconds to see, if you're kind of understanding the content. And then this is a good chance for you to think, do I need to ask some questions? Do I need some further understanding? Again, we will go through more examples throughout class to help us predict using correlation, but I just want you to see positive and negative, and then weak or strong, basically. Okay, so in number 1 in this guided practice, it says for each scatter plot, describe the correlation shown and tell whether the correlation coefficient is closest to those values we talked about before. So in number 1, I would definitely say that shows some sort of positive correlation. Definitely. And to me, I don't think that correlation is super strong. It does follow a trend in the positive direction, but I would still say that that is probably closer to 0.5. Okay, closest to 0.5. Doesn't follow a line very closely. And again, it's a judgment call. If you thought it was close to 1, we can talk about that later. All right, and then part 2, we look at this correlation. It's kind of all over the map to me, so I would say that is no correlation. There's no relation there. That is very, very hard to predict. So that would be closest to, I would say, 0. No correlation at all. So that's a 0. Correlation coefficient at 0 means no correlation whatsoever. So again, there's going to be more activities in this lesson. There's going to be more chances for you to look at data and predict. So that's why these notes were a little bit shorter. So you can move on to the next step in the lesson. I want to show you guys a real life example of how to predict and putting that into practice. So you can move on to the next step in the lesson.